Hi everybody, I'm Ketumati and I'm really sorry I can't be with you this weekend. I've really been looking forward to it, but I have a clash. So I've had to record my talk in advance and I hope to join you on the day, even for just a short time for a Q&A session afterwards. Like all the other talks, which I'm also very sorry to be missing, though this because I know where they'll be going, I'm going to focus on this question of the transcendent, but take it from a slightly different perspective. So my motivation in picking up this question of the transcendent, I think, can be illustrated with perhaps a personal anecdote. I find the end of the year, the end of the calendar year, usually quite difficult, quite tiring, and I'm already quite tired. And I find the orgy of consumption which the end of the year presents as often unpleasant and distasteful. And in the last few years, of course, we've been juggling many other things, making the problematic nature of this kind of celebration all the more obvious. I'm talking, of course, in terms of the general state of the planet and the world, and a mood of darkness that I feel I'm not alone in feeling has settled upon us. In fact, I find, especially at that time of year, that there is a strong sense of disintegration, a sense of collapse in value and direction. And with that also being played out in the public sphere where there is polarization and disintegration as well, feeding further that sense of collapse. So in this kind of situation, which I find viscerally painful, the question is, where is value? What is value? Now, as an order member, as a Buddhist, obviously my answer to that lies in the Dharma. It lies in some sense of the transcendent, as we've been introduced to the Dharma by Bhante Sangharakshita. But for the working definition of the transcendent that I'm going to use here, it is precisely the answer to that question, that which is of value. In fact, that which is of value because it is of supreme value, which I think is presupposed by the idea that it's of value in the first place. And, of course, for it to be of value, it must also be real. But what does this mean? This is the question. And again, I want us to start from where we are, that is, in our culture, and I would guess I'm primarily addressing those like me who are from the global north, with our specific perspective, its insights and its blind spots. So what I'm going to do is to read some great Western thinkers who've confronted these challenges about the absence of value, the collapse of value in earlier crises of civilization, crises of our civilization, of Western, as we call it, civilization. And specifically, I'm going to focus on two important thinkers, one of whom was clearly also explicitly important to Bhante, that is Nietzsche, and following him, Albert Schweitzer. So it might seem a bit odd to be referencing Nietzsche. Sridharvan, of course, has done this as well in his talk, or will do. I'm afraid I can't remember the order quite right now. But it may seem surprising, picking up on Nietzsche, who, of course, is such a profoundly anti-transcendental thinker. But I hope to make some sense of that for you. So both Nietzsche and Schweitzer, just to map out the talk, are clearly in this Western tradition, the Western tradition that has shaped my thinking, shaped who I am, and therefore is a crucial starting point. Because in exploring where they go, we can climb on their shoulders and see some of the roots out of the pit of despond and lack of value that they found, explored, and then in fact have mapped and offered to us. And in fact, standing on their shoulders, we can therefore also go a bit further, as we need to, not least because the crisis of civilization that we face is interestingly, importantly, different to theirs. Not least, in fact, can we do that because we also now have meaningful access to various forms of non-Western thought, which they themselves presented a route towards, most obviously in terms of various types of, as I say, non-Western thought. Schweitzer was particularly interested in Chinese thought, but also, of course, in the context of what we're talking about today, the Dharma. The Dharma that Nietzsche in particular had no access to and largely misunderstood, even though he was intuitively drawn towards it, I feel. So in other words, what we're going to talk through today is how, starting from what can I or must I do here and now in this moment, the early 21st century, as a Westerner, we can pursue this line of thinking to open up completely unprecedented territory about thought and practice and potentially even insight regarding the transcendent, what it is, how it relates to me. And so in the end, doing much more than answering that original question. So to go back then, my starting point, as I said, is that I feel that we are living in an age of transparent civilizational disintegration. This is hugely painful, confusing, infuriating, and I think also eliciting, again, not just in me, important elements of defiance. And in this regard, I have found great solace and inspiration in reading Nietzsche. Nietzsche is, I would argue, a sage for our times and a window of all ethics in the West that is, as it were, not so much postmodern, a loaded term, but after modern. Nietzsche takes on this role in terms of arguing with unprecedented clarity and force for the centrality of ethics in any revival beyond this moment, that is, of course, transcending this moment, to use the term of the moment that we're talking about, but also about the primacy of personal ethical responsibility in that. Personal ethical responsibility. Of course, then resonating very strongly into Bante's teachings on the true individual and the importance of personal practice of Shila, or Sila, as in Sheila Bardin's name, indeed. So I feel this is of key relevance today. Nietzsche was writing at the end of the 19th century and felt then that he was living in an age of civilizational twilight. And he saw, or foresaw, I think with unique prescience, the emergence of what he called the last man. That is, a period in which people would be living for no particular reason, but just sort of being nice, but vacillating, going nowhere, and in various ways, therefore, disintegrating. This feels to me very much exactly what the modern world is in the 21st century. In other words, what Nietzsche saw at the end of the 19th century has now clearly arrived, and we are actually living through it. So last time, in the last year, in this retreat, we were talking about the higher evolution. So another way of thinking about this is in those terms, because one of the conclusions we came to then was the importance of this distinction between the higher evolution, which Bhante introduces, and the further evolution, which is what is described, for instance, by Yuval Noah Harari in his discussion of Homo Deus, of humans, or at least the small sections of humans, becoming ever more capable, taking on almost sort of godlike powers, but at the cost of the planet, of the majority of people, of life on Earth, and of huge inequality and destruction. So we have this distinction between higher and further evolution. But what is higher, in a sense, is our question when we come back to transcendence. It seems obvious in a way, doesn't it, what higher means? It means higher in value. That is, higher in accordance with the truth. And this in turn suggests higher both in terms of an ethical sense. Ethics feels really important here in terms of this question of value, and therefore transcendence. But what does this mean? What does this connection between ethics and transcendence mean? This is the focus that I want to bring out. In fact, through Nietzsche and then into Schweitzer, we find arresting, counterintuitive arguments that this connection between ethics and transcendence is much more complicated. They aren't the same thing. In fact, in many ways, they are opposed. Let's move to Schweitzer. Schweitzer is writing his greatest work also about 100 years ago, also therefore in a moment of transparent civilizational crisis between the First World War and the Second World War. This, of course, is the moment, the culmination and vindication of the collapse of civilization that Nietzsche was foreseeing 20 plus years beforehand. And this is a moment, and specifically in Central Europe, that would have been particularly troubling and visceral, and that in some ways is darker than the present, though we must say that in the context of now actual outbreak of war, ours too is fast darkening in prospect in shocking new ways. But perhaps also 100 years ago there were ways in which it was a quantum less troubling than we face today. 100 years ago they were not contemplating ecocide. They were not contemplating mass proliferation of digital or cyber or bioweapons, messing with life. So there is still a strong analogy between the present and this terrible moment that Schweitzer is living through, even though we are 100 years on from that. In fact, on my reading, it suggests that the entire period between these, while it has risen and fallen again, is simply another turn of the wheel. So in this predicament, 100 years ago, which is then, as I say, so illuminating for us now, Schweitzer asks profound questions about the history of civilization, in particular of his own contemporaneous, that is, Western civilization, and regarding its rise and fall. And he argues, perhaps to start with, most forcefully, that to understand what civilization is, we must understand it as an ethical phenomenon. In other words, the rise and fall of civilization, or civilizations in a specific form, is a matter of the rise and fall of a powerful and demotic, that is, distributed across the population, ethical sensibility or ethics. But in doing this, he then points out a crucial conundrum, which is the one I want to pick up, which is that ethics is not only not the same thing as the transcendent or the spiritual, based on historical evidence. They don't go hand in hand, but in fact, they seem to be opposed. They seem to draw in opposite directions. Specifically, Schweitzer identifies ethics as that which is affirming the world. That is, it has an optimistic worldview. Whereas transcendence, or civilizations oriented to transcendence, tend to see value outside the world, and therefore to forms of life or forms of culture which are world negating. That is, which are pessimistic about the nature of reality around us, secular reality. And therefore, the arising of the one is the cost of the other. Ethics, therefore, as a world-affirming, optimistic perspective, tends to move away from a concern for transcendence. Conversely, concern for transcendence tends to overwhelm questions of ethics in the world. And for Schweitzer, as indeed for the Buddha, the classic example of this is Brahmanism. As he puts it, by its very nature, ethics affirms the world. It calls for doing good actively and effectively. Hence we may say that affirmation of the world exerts a favourable influence upon the advancement of ethics, and that ethics has difficulty thriving in a climate of negation of the world. In the first case, it can act according to its nature. In the second case, it becomes artificial. So this is a profoundly confounding starting point. We were looking for value, and we assumed that this would be in ethics and therefore in transcendence, and yet we find that these two things actually pull in opposite directions. But then Schweitzer adds to the challenge here, because he identifies as characteristic of the Western worldview precisely such a world-affirming and optimistic approach. But he notes a characteristic error in this. So there is a self-propelling ratchet or dynamic in world affirmation and optimistic worldview, in that acting in that way creates a certain world which then is proven to be correct. But in the creation of a positive sense, a positive zeitgeist of uplift, and Schweitzer here is specifically talking about the 18th century Enlightenment, increasingly for oneself in that society and for society as a whole, the, as it were, holy grail of progress appears to be in the construction of a theory or practice of ethics that is perfectly coherent with and immanent from the real nature of reality in the world. and where one can be constantly in parallel perfecting that understanding of the world. Hence, in other words, it's committed to an approach to ethics which is itself committed to the definitively perfected understanding of the world, and then such that we can live in perfect, rational, harmonious compatibility with that, up to and including what the Greeks would call eudaimonistic flourishing of all things. That the condition of possibility of flourishing of one is the condition of possibility of flourishing of all. Hence he says, since Hume, philosophy, by which he means Western philosophy, of course, if we accept Nietzsche, takes for granted that ethics is primarily a matter of fellow feeling and of helpful action flowing out of natural sympathy and developed in our understanding of reality. In short, the Western worldview, the optimistic Western worldview, takes form of believing that we move progressively to perfecting our ethics and hence our way of life by learning about the world and how it works and perfecting that. But, says Schweitzer, again recalling this moment of civilizational disintegration, history has shown us, Western history has shown us, that time and again this approach has failed. As he says, can altruism be justified? Can ethics be justified within the terms of a worldview? Ethical thinkers have constantly endeavoured to do this, and yet we find in the history of Western thought and Western philosophy that they have never succeeded. And not only have they not succeeded, this is not just the setting up of a process where there are minor and incremental accumulation of falsifications, which then enables continual scientific improvement of our understanding of the world, all of which would be perfectly compatible with that approach. No, much, much worse. What we find rather is that this approach actually leads to complete breakdown, time and again. Systemic breakdown, shocking and sudden descent, plunging, that is actively diving into its undoing, into hatred, into violence, into barbarism, into genocide. And recall that Schweitzer was writing before the Holocaust, again with frightening prescience. In other words, to the ruination of all ideals, which leaves us both individually and collectively shipwrecked, without value, abandoned, bereft in an ethical desert. Indeed, where the determined pursuit in the sense of things falling apart to follow ever more radical and impassioned programs of revolutionizing the world, because the way we live is not in accordance with it as we understand it. That leads actually to a rocketing of that destruction, even as it may come along dressed as its saviour. Again, Schweitzer says, if we attempt to comprehend the phenomenal world as it is and deduce principles of conduct from it, we are doomed to scepticism, pessimism, and we might say nihilism and destruction. Now, this is obviously a dramatic point, but in a sense it doesn't have to be that dramatic and on so grand a scale, because Schweitzer reminds us that, again quoting him, life attracts, as they say, with 1,000 expectations and fulfills hardly one of them, as a matter of course. In other words, even as ethics is optimistic world affirmation, its optimistic pursuit actually leads, time and again, to its nemesis, to a supremely, indeed innovatively, in the context of further evolution, unethical individual and collective life. So let's recap. Where have we got to? We found that we find ourselves now in a yet darker place. Ethics is not the transcendent, and transcendence is here understood as life negation, pessimism. So it's not higher. But neither is ethics, neither is this optimistic world affirmation higher either. So where are we left? We have nothing but darkness. We have nothing. Indeed, this conclusion of nihilism is precisely the inescapable conclusion to which pursuing and understanding ethics in this way, says Schweitzer, and indeed Nietzsche, will lead. That in fact has led them with such pain in both cases. Indeed, going back to Nietzsche, I think this understanding is as accurate, or at least as evocative, a summary of his insightful but actually racked state of suffering and despair that I can come up with. But staying with Nietzsche, what do we find? We find in him, and again in Schweitzer, in fact, that there remains light. They are in the darkest of nights. But Nietzsche, most obviously, does not just curl up in a ball and give up and die. Rather, he says, yes. He affirms with even greater vigour. And he doesn't just whisper this yes, he bellows it. He bellows it into the darkness. In other words, he finds the source of his ethical yearning and energy in himself. That is, in humanity at the collective level, but as a collective of individuals who can similarly do such affirmation for themselves. He says, bring it on, effectively. And this, of course, is what leads to his singularly bracing, compelling, lightning strike kind of teachings regarding the Übermensch, or the eternal recurrence of the same. That is, in Nietzsche, and then reaffirmed and clarified in Schweitzer, we find the intuition and the potential fruition of an ethically superior way of being is to be found entirely in the heart-mind of the person, not out there in the universe. So Nietzsche affirms this, but he lacks the support around him, the civilizational, cultural support around him to affirm him in that affirmation, to support him and allow him to do something with it. And so he died. Great, a hugely sad story, in pain and madness. Schweitzer can take this a one step further, though. Specifically, he expresses a key insight, this key insight, in terms of two crucial conceptual innovations or neologisms, one of which will be highly familiar to you, that is Weltanschauung, or worldview, but one which will be less familiar, my guess, which is Lifeview. Indeed, it seems indicative of the subsequent neglect of Schweitzer's thought, even though he won a Nobel Prize, that we all know the former term, but hardly any of us have heard of the latter. including myself, until I stumbled upon his work a few years ago. Schweitzer argues, as I've said, that a civilization rises and falls with its ethics, but in particular it arises and falls with the self-confirming fecundity in the world of a worldview, that is, of the theory or map of the world, of the way in which reality is out there. So a civilization falls into decline when the world it is actively creating through its model of the world, its worldview, manifestly exceeds the understanding of it enabled by that very worldview. So worldview really matters. Whatever I now go on to say, please don't take away that I think that worldview is unimportant. Quite the contrary, it's extremely important. But there is also this other aspect, which is life view, though we hardly notice it. And by life view, I mean the inhabited first-person perspective of oneself as life. That we ourselves are life, or that which wills to live. And indeed, Schweitzer highlights that life view is in fact primary. It is life view that determines worldview. Though not only have we rarely even thought about life view, but we presume the opposite. We presume that it is our worldview that is primary. That if we get our worldview right, if we are working hard as good people to get our understanding of the way in which the world is, to get that right, we will then be progressively moving towards living in productive harmony with the world as it is. But, says Schweitzer, this is mistaken, because there is in fact no value in the world. There is no value in the world out there. But there is only value posited and created by us as life specifically. And as life specifically following what Nietzsche also has to say about life. As he notes, again, to quote him, the elemental fact that confronts us, present in our consciousness every moment of our existences, is I am life that wills to live, in the midst of life that wills to live. So taken together, we reach a radical conclusion. In fact, one in direct contradiction with our default, that is, worldview as primary, understanding of ethics. Again, to quote him, I've mentioned this already, but he says, if we attempt to comprehend the phenomenal world as it is, and deduce principles of conduct from it, we are doomed to skepticism and pessimism. He continues, though, on the contrary, ethics is an act of spiritual independence on our part. Or as he puts it, the world is horror in splendour, meaninglessness in meaning, sorrow in joy. Ethics is not in tune with the phenomenal world, but in rebellion against it. It is the manifestation of a spirit that desires to be different from the spirit that manifests itself in the universe. So let's now return to this question of ethics and transcendence. with 3 steps. First of all, how we can rejuvenate and reclaim ethics from this Lifeview perspective. Secondly, how it then reframes transcendence and illuminates transcendence. And then, with that, the inseparability of transcendence and ethics. And then last but by no means least, crucial lessons regarding the present, here and now. So Schweitzer, following Nietzsche, has shown that ethics is a question of, or from, the perspective of oneself being life that wills to live amongst other lives, or living things that will to live. And this transforms our understanding and lived practice of ethics in a way that becomes progressively richer and more compelling and just self-evidently true. The more we inhabit it, the more we inhabit this life view as first, as primary perspective. Moreover, it does this in ways that also progressively resonate with our intuitive ethical optimism. Hence, in a way that is productive and integrating, as opposed to being split, alienated, destructive, as must be the case where our intuition about the nature of value and of ethics is divorced from what we are learning to be the case from thinking more deeply. Specifically, I want to highlight just a number of key features about Schweitzer's compelling account of ethics built upon life view as primary. First and foremost, we find that ethics becomes precisely the activity of affirmation of the world. So it's an activity, it's a practice, something also, of course, strongly emphasized in Buddhist ethics. You can't be ethical, as it were, by being a nice person in your head. So in activity of affirmation of the world, and through or as affirmation of life. Affirmation of life in general, but also affirmation of the life of specific other beings, and where those specific beings include oneself. Indeed, where the affirmation of the life of other things and oneself is the affirmation of life. It is in the affirmation that we are affirming. So one's will to live is thus no different to that of others. Again, compare important statements to that effect, for instance, in Shantideva. And is realized in willing the life of others who also, as alive, will to live. Hence also we find the ethical imperative of the life of every and each individual living thing. Something that again resonates strongly with our intuition about ethics. It's not about, as I said just now, being a nice person in one's head or getting one's metaphysics right. It's about actually being good to this person, to this being. And as a stance that can, with Nietzsche, in fact, only be taken by the individual as self-conscious will to live themselves. Finally then, for Schweitzer, this leads to a process by which, while there is again no value out there in the world, humanity and specific human persons as self-conscious will to live may nonetheless lift themselves by their bootstraps that is, embark upon a process of ethical ascendance, both in practice and in character, as in one's evolving disposition and capacity. Through a process that finds fulfillment of its will to live in affirming the will to live of life itself. That is, in his terminology, as reverence for life. In other words, moving towards increasingly being able to live as life revering life. As he puts it, by ethical conduct toward all creatures, we enter into a spiritual relationship with the universe. In the universe, the will to live is in conflict with itself. In us, it seeks to be at peace with itself. In the universe, the will to live is a fact. In us, it is a revelation. The mind commands us to be different from the universe. By reverence for life, we become, in profound, elemental, and vital fashion, devout. So hopefully it's clear now that we've reclaimed ethical value and direction, and of a specifically reintegrating and uplifting sort. Indeed, even, it seems, now, of a new transcendence. And this leads us to the second point, that is, of reframing our conception of transcendence. Schweitzer builds on and converts upon Nietzsche in this reconnection to the transcendent, having gone through the dark night of the death of God. That is, the dark night of nihilism and a purely secular materialist worldview, or worldview as primary. So here we have a clearer and indeed workable, something that we can put into practice, sense of higher, with clear resonance again to the distinction between higher evolution and further evolution. But Schweitzer, of course, is not the last word. In fact, he points beyond himself in a way that I think speaks highly of, as evidence of the value of what he has to say. And we must note, at least to start with, that it's really easy to have misunderstood his argument and simply to appropriate it to something with which we are more familiar, potentially with disastrous consequences. This danger specifically hinges, in fact, on whether one has actively begun to work at, to transform one's self-conscious, or rather deep and tacit embedded concept precisely of the transcendent. That is, as, to start with my working definition again, the nature and locus of supreme and real value. Because if we haven't done the work on the concept of the transcendent and have simply gone with this argument about ethics and life view, given the beings that we are, and again specifically as late modern Western beings who have grown up thinking with worldview as primary, we can take this argument about Lifeview and fit it tidily into that existing perspective. And the dangers of this, I think, are particularly clear at the present. That is, they become obvious in moments of Western, or what I'm calling Northern culture, at moments of civilizational crisis, when the exhaustion of a specific dominant and settled worldview is manifest. And therefore there is a desperate scrambling around for other new and extreme, polarized, most likely, sources of existential security. In particular, we can see this at work when this idea of Lifeview could be picked up and politicized. So we see two mistaken responses to the lessons of Nietzsche and Schweitzer, roughly on the left, on the right, regarding Schweitzer on the left and Nietzsche on the right, respectively. On the left, we might find those who claim that, yes, Schweitzer is right and we should side with life. That is, as against the boogeyman of your choice, the machine, the establishment, money, capitalism. Here we see, for instance, then language in the form of demanding a revolution for life. Various forms, in other words, of updated Lebensphilosophy, which is extremely familiar. There, indeed, at the very beginning of the 19th century, and therefore entirely familiar to Nietzsche, something that he has clearly moved beyond. We see it also today, contemporarily, in, for instance, for those of you to whom this means something, the so-called ontological turn in anthropology, or a thoughtless, potentially lazy appropriation of or celebration of so-called indigenous thought. Now, to be clear here, I'm not saying there's nothing there. There is indeed huge resource and learning to be had from that exploration. But simply saying that the way we think is wrong, and that therefore we should return to some sort of indigenous way of thinking about the world, is pie in the sky. We can't simply unlearn or think differently. So the result of this is a militating, as I say, for life. But this is not Lifeview, because Lifeview is acting as life. And it is not acting as life as nature. Nature itself is a modern concept about the world out there. Indeed, a supremely Enlightenment concept. It is life as apprehended by the rational intellect and made sense of through a scientific sensibility. But this is not what Schweitzer means. He means, as I say, acting as life and as will to live, not as nature. But we see this also potentially on the right, which grabs onto the terminology of will and distorts it instead, forgetting about this idea of the will to live and the will to live of all beings, of other beings, and hence of reverence for life. Instead, even if we can't quite accuse Nietzsche of this, we can see how easily misapprehended this is, or indeed actually has been in history, where the argument about will is simply grabbed on as, from a worldview first perspective, as will, or rather will to power. This is simply a license, in other words, for fascism presenting itself as wisdom, with disdain for the stupid and the weak-hearted. Sheer ego assertion, in other words, and self-legitimizing as indeed all that there really is. So to avoid both traps, we must look clearly at the profound challenge to our given conception of the transcendent, which is always already there in the background, conditioning our response and experience, not least to new things, new thoughts, new ways of thinking. How does this get challenged by taking Lifeview as primary really seriously? The default conception of transcendence in the North emerges in comparison, I think most clearly, with other dominant conceptions over history and geography, in turn illuminating different key dimensions of transcendence. Specifically, we can compare, I think, at the very least, our modern Western default conception, that is in its full manifestation of an optimistic ethical worldview. So that is thinking of our perspective of the transcendence is secular materialist and progressive, moving towards an ever better life on earth. What we could summarize in terms of the grand terminology of a capital R reason and utopia. But we can compare this to other hugely informative, insightful, and in fact influential ways of thinking about the transcendent, such as a monotheistic approach, that is of God, in particular those ideas coming from West Asia, of a Chinese perspective, of Tao, and of a South Asian perspective, whether in Hindu Advaita Vedanta or indeed in the Dharma, as this has come to us from that part of the world in terms of awakening or enlightenment. So comparing the way we think about supreme value with these other ways suggests at least 4 key dimensions of transcendence. Our way of thinking about transcendence is secular or immanent in comparison to an otherworldly or transcendent idea, which we see, for instance, in monotheisms and in Hinduism. Our perspective is also literal. We in the West believe in the literal realization of this good, as opposed to thinking of it in terms of pragmatic terms, as a path, which we see, for instance, in Taoism or indeed in South Asian thought, Hindu or Buddhist. Our perspective is also the transcendent is the endpoint to which we are moving rather than a process. So again, we have the North, our perspective, in comparison to the Chinese perspective of a decent way of living in harmony with the world, or indeed of Islam, living in accordance, in obedience with the word of Allah. And last and by no means least, we find a distinction between transcendence as the extreme, the supreme, and as a matter of balance. Again, a clear distinction between us as the former, the best is always more, and the most is better than the more. And Tao, or Chinese perspective, which has Zhongyang, which means always looking for the middle, the balance. So I've summarized this in a table which hopefully will be made available to you. But what this clarifies is that the North default conception of transcendence is, for starters, specific and limited, as indeed are they all, but it can also be more accurately specified as secular or immanent, literal, product or endpoint, and extreme. So from this perspective, we can now return to Lifeview and the shift in our conception of the transcendent that is needed to accommodate it, to accommodate this initial insight, and indeed practice in the longer term of Lifeview as primary. For the shift to a self-conscious ethical stance as will to live, amongst other wills to live, is radically incompatible with an understanding of transcendence as really that which may or must or indeed will, in our most optimistic moments, be achieved in secular material actuality out there. The former asserts its recognition that there is no such value in the world, and it only comes into the world through self-conscious, deliberate, and unrelenting effort of the person as self-conscious reverence for life. In other words, Schweitzer is absolutely right that conceptualized in the default way that we tend to think of it in the West, in the North, as I'm saying it, ethics and transcendence are necessarily opposed, but this is as much, if not more, because of our inadequate conception, our mistaken, if in fact highly productive, so not worthless or wicked, conception of transcendence, as it is because of our misunderstanding of ethics and its nature. So likewise then, there is no actual shifting to embody and practice Lifeview, the ethical insights of Schweitzer and Nietzsche, without clear work on our given understanding of transcendence. Shifting it to what, though? Lifeview is what, in fact? It is view of life that wills to live. It is therefore view. Hence it is a first-person perspective. Hence the transcendence, or the locus of supreme value, is not out there to be found if we go about it correctly, but always already here, in here. It is the looker, not the looked upon. Hence it is a matter of mind, or mind first, at least pragmatically, if not metaphysically. And it is a view of life, life view, that is, of oneself being life. And where, as noted above, life is not itself a matter of nature out there, but that which courses through us. Indeed, relating to the higher evolution, the evolution and unfolding of will in its supreme form as will to live. Life is therefore the cosmic process, ultimately, of the unfolding of the will of the transcendent, the transcendence will. Lifeview, in other words, is nothing other than right view, the first of the Noble Eightfold Path. And so the transcendent is reframed as none of the default conceptions constructed. It's not just not the one that we inhabit in the modern West, but neither is it that from monotheism, from the Tao, from Advaita Vedanta, from South Asian thought. Rather, it is that which is through us and in us, and in our interaction with others, and indeed with the cosmos as a whole, that is, our interaction with the world out there, attempting to live towards its own self-realization. So the transcendent is quite simply everything. It is reality in its totality and in its supreme value. Hence that about which nothing meaningfully can be said, and yet which is the substance and telos of all things. And hence, for each of us, individually and inseparably, collectively, the task is also itself then clear. It is the development, the surrender to, and the realization of this transcendent from within ourselves into the world. Indeed, from this shift in perspective, we can see clearly and situate now both the value and the mistake of our default conception of this optimistic ethics that is the northern approach. There is an ethical genius in this approach, in this stance, in its life-affirming optimistic ethical perspective. As will to live, optimistically asserting itself and asserting its positivity and personal responsibility, that is, sila, in the world. This is indeed not only living thereby in a way that is able to create value and ethical life and community in the world, but it's also, obviously, its necessary presupposition. If we don't live in that way, it is by definition impossible. The error lies, though, in placing the basis of that optimism out there in the world, in our worldview, and especially in our worldview as primary, when its grounds actually lie in itself, that is, in us living as Lifeview. So in Nietzsche and Schweitzer, we thus find the first key thinkers, at least in the Western tradition, for a grown-up, post-adolescent ethics for humanity. Standing on its own feet. Finally then, to close, let us return to the original challenge of the incompatibility of transcendence and ethics. We have now reconceptualized both ethics and transcendence. The former to Lifeview, practicing reverence for life. That is, in a way, akin to right view, then leading directly into right emotion or resolve. And the latter, that is transcendence, as what there really is, things as they really are. And with that, the reality of what is of supreme value, seeking its self-realization in and through us as living beings. As such, though, I hope also that it's evident that there is now no longer any such conceptual contradiction or incompatibility between ethics and the transcendent. Rather, the former is simply the practice, the ground, and the deepening fruition of the latter. And what has crucially brought the two together into this mutually productive relation is precisely a shift to a pragmatic mind first or first person perspective. In other words, to the primacy of our attention in practice to chitta, its development, or bhavana. But what is that other than the Dharma? Again, further emphasizing how Lifeview is simply right view. Since chitta bhavana, that is meditation and mindfulness, cultivating the heart-mind, is precisely the teaching of the Buddha, the crucial connection mediating between ethics and oneself becoming transcendence. Ethics, meditation, wisdom. Chitta bhavana, therefore, is the essential bridge, to put it differently, from ethics as the karma niyama to wisdom and transcendence as the dharma niyama. And our conclusion may thus be stated briefly. We are confronted today by two paths: higher evolution or further evolution. A life view as primary, a life view first, renewal of ethics as reverence for life, or deepening civilizational decline, decadence, disintegration, with worldview as primary and worldview eating itself. But we have in all of that one key practice: chitta bhavana. It is chitta bhavana or bust. Thank you.